live in Mission, Texas. Hi, Bill.
And Dana, good morning to you. And we've got a major update to a cartel-related story we first brought to our viewers last week. Let's get right into these photos again, which we showed last week, showing several armed cartel gunmen crossing illegally here into the Rio Grande Valley in the Fronton, Texas area. Texas DPS now confirms to Fox News 2 of those gunmen have been arrested after crossing illegally in the exact same area again, while armed with guns again.
And you are not talking about cartel. Mm-hmm. First of all, I think that the word cartel, the concept is wrong.
Yeah, what's old? Yeah.
It's old,
yeah.
Exactly. It's old, exactly, because you were talking about Pablo Escobar, Bolivia, Pablo Escobar, and Colombia. But now, you know, the way that media represents these groups is like there's a cartel, there's a corporation, there's a company. That's not true. We are talking about systems and the complex adaptive system. They became like these small cells that adapt
to autonomous.
Autonomous, and not all of them are trafficking drugs. Some of them are just kidnapping. Some of them are participating in human smuggling, and they manage because of the capacity. They have arms. They control the territory. So if you want to bring, with smugglers, with human smugglers, you want to bring your people through here, you have to pay me per person this money, and I will give you a code. That's exactly what they do. Some of these groups that they're complex adaptive systems, and so you see how they now behave in Tamaulipas, Zacatecas, and they were Zetas zones. They have always been Zetas zones. In Veracruz, in Tabasco. All these groups are dominating illicit activities, and they are part of illicit network.
Welcome to the Border Wars Podcast. We are the #1 podcast of the Americas, the only bilingual podcast that takes you beyond the border. I say we're the #1 podcast not because of me, because of our guest. And we have a beautiful guest here today. I called her a Mayan princess, and I had it totally wrong because she has a very lovely dress on. But she corrected me real quick, and she said, she's from Mexico. Guadalupe Correa is with us today. And she said, that's from India, by the way. So I was a little bit off on my geography. Guadalupe, how are you? How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very excited to be here.
And we're excited to have you. I've been wanting to get you on the podcast because if there's one podcast that you have to do, Guadalupe, it's Border Wars, because your work has been about the border I've known you fairly recently, but I've looked at your CV, very impressive. And I looked at all the books and publications and research that you've done. And I venture to say you may be one of the foremost experts on the border with Mexico.
I guess so. I lived at the border for 8 years, but I've been writing, and, I go there all the time. And, I'm going to be publishing a book. I co-authored the book with a friend of mine.
Okay.
A journalist, and we have traveled all along the border. The first time, 2013, the whole border, the whole Mexico's border.
Yeah. But the U.S.-Mexico border.
The U.S.-Mexico border, from both sides of the border. We are describing each border municipality on the Mexican side, of course, and each border county, everything about the border.
And that was in 2013?
No, 2013, 2019, 2021.
Okay.
And at different points, because I lived in Brownsville, Texas.
Yeah, no, I'm familiar with Brownsville. It's very, it's a nice area.
Very nice.
Getting not as nice as the time goes on. Is getting a little out of my experience there, but we'll talk about that another day. There's a podcast about that, by the way. But let's go to the beginning, because I want the audience to get to know you. You're obviously a very prolific academic. You've written, you teach. You're at George Mason University. I think you're a professor at the School of Policy and Government at George Mason. Is that correct? Uh-huh. And but take us back. So you're from Mexico originally?
I was born and raised in Mexico, and I studied economics in Mexico City at the Universidad Iberoamericana. So I was an economist.
Oh, very nice, very nice. And were you born in Mexico City?
I was born near Mexico City, in the state of Mexico, very near Mexico City. But usually I was raised in Mexico City, where my family lives.
When did you come to the U.S.?
I started. I studied my PhD 2000.
Okay.
In New York City.
Oh, wow. Okay, so you went from Mexico City to New York.
Exactly.
So like just bad traffic all around.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's correct.
Yeah. No, I mean, Mexico City is serious. I mean, I once walked faster 10 blocks than I could drive. So I have fond memories of Mexico City. So in Mexico back then, what was your big takeaway when you moved to the United States? What was the big memory that you had of Mexico back then? And obviously you go back now as a professional, as a researcher, but what existed then that you see changed now? I'm sure a lot of things, but...
A lot of things, but it was, I mean, when I was born, we were living the PRI era, which we had a party in power for more than 70 years. Yeah. And, politics started to change in the 1990s. Well, late 80s. During the 1990s was a democratic transition to democracy. But at the same time, the promises of the economic policies that were changing because of the end of import substitution industrialization. I became an economist when the model changed.
When the ISI,
Yeah, I mean, that was the end of it, the promises of globalization, the so-called neoliberal policies that are not very neoliberal, neoliberal, but anyway, that's how they are framed, the Washington Consensus, and the peso crisis of 1994. After that. So that time of recurrent economic crisis of the emerging.
Is that what made you study economics?
Yeah, I mean, everybody studied economics at this time. A lot of people. Yeah. So that was kind of like a profession.
That's true, because with the Washington Consensus, people were like, "Oh, this is a career track. We're all going to move into becoming macroeconomists and stuff like that." That makes sense.
Exactly.
I want to ask you, I'm going to diverge a little bit because I want to ask you, you said something, this was the era of what some people call hyperglobalization, right? Yep. 1989 through 2009, arguably. Yeah. Do you feel like we're at the end of that? Do you feel like, there's this question that I've been asked a lot of times, the end of globalization, right? So I think the New York Times wrote an article about this recently. How do you feel about that? Since you lived and you kind of, you broke your professional bread during this period, how do you feel about globalization?
Yes, that was it. That was the end of the Cold War. Let's say that, right? When the United States was the hegemonic power, there was no question. The winner of the Cold War, the United States, and everything had to do with a model that was created in Washington. There was a consensus, the double transition towards democracy and capitalism. I mean, that was the end of history, according to Francis Fukuyama. And Samuel Huntington. This was a time of the end of history. That was it. The United States ruling the world and initiating and deciding about all the projects and globalization the way that we conceive it. And at this point, we have a multipolar world. Yeah. In the arrival of China. Exactly. Yeah. That is the difference. Mm-hmm. We have poles of power. We have Russia, we have China. I'm not sure how much Russia, but still is in the conversation.
It's there, yeah.
Yeah. And, they have some control arms, nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
And
they're invading countries.
Exactly. That is correct. Yeah. That is correct. So we have three poles of power: Eurasia, Asia, and the Western world, I would say, right? The Eastern world versus the Western world. I would say in many ways, if we can just describe the two poles of power, I would say China and Europe and the United States, right? So, I mean, Russia and China versus Europe and the United States. And at that time of the 1990s, when the Washington Consensus was something that we needed to understand because we needed to abide by, I'm from Mexico. It was Latin America.
Yeah, NAFTA.
Yeah. Absolutely NAFTA. But after the oil crisis and the debt crisis, so a new beginning. The promises of this double transition, the end of the import substitution industrialization model, and the beginning of globalization. Is this over? This is over as we conceived it, but the processes and the technology has taken us to an era where there is also a lot of dependency, but the supply chains that were built during the 1990s are over. So the reorganization of the supply chains and the United States after.
You're talking about nearshoring?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So this is a big transformation. We're living in a new world order.
Yeah.
That's also led by players that were similar. They have more power, but those players that are right now have their headquarters in China and are Chinese themselves. Of course, they have become so powerful, so rich because of the order that initiated them in the 1990s, right? The investments in this region with a lot of people that could provide work in a very cheap manner.
Yeah. Well, you could say China was maybe one of the winners of the globalization process, right? Because they integrated what was once a very closed society, kind of a insular economic model, to opening up their economy. There's a lot of debate as to why they did that, if it was actually a means to an end or if it was in and of itself. I agree. I think I had to give a presentation recently about the end of globalization. And I also studied economics, from George Mason, actually. So, a very free market approach, we're not, free trade is good. It's voluntary, it's mutually beneficial, but, the world doesn't really operate in a theory that's, more directly understood in a textbook. It's, a lot of nuance and a lot of granularity to it. So what I've seen is, what I've described more as like a process of creative destruction of globalization, like it's transforming. And I think you hit it on the nail on the head with the supply chains. Because, if you look at what they call the structure of production, as the economics,
right.
the raw materials are still going to stay the raw materials. They're still going to be in the same places where they usually are. The consumer goods are still going to be in consumer markets, which are the biggest ones. Usually it's Asia, Europe, North America are the biggest consumer markets in the world. I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. But the intermediate goods, the supply chains, all the stuff like the steel that you need, the wheat that you need for agriculture, all the fertilizers, all the stuff that you need to produce those end consumer goods that you drive from raw materials, that's all changing. And that's becoming closer to shores.
Yeah, but there's something else. Technology, the chips, the microprocessors. All these, technology that can be produced in the global south. They use this, this idea of the global south and the global north, just to show us that, in a way, this is the end of globalization as we conceived it. But on the other hand, it's global in nature, this process, right? Because it has to do with the forces in the world anyway. So you don't stop completely your communication, because it's interesting. We don't really know.
Yeah, we're more connected now than ever before, globally.
Exactly. Yeah. So on the one hand, we have the we have the disintegration of the supply chains as we used to know them. But on the other hand, you can contact anybody in any part of the world through WhatsApp. It's you're more connected than at any other moment, and that's
a good point.
Global.
We're perhaps less dependent on global supply chains, but we're more dependent on international communications that stream, for any one corner of the world to the other corner of the world. What I've described as, there's actually a book, I think it was Shannon O'Neill who wrote this in Council Foreign Relations. Exactly. It was an interesting book because, what I took away from it, I can't remember the title of it.
So it's about supply chains.
It is
her latest book, but I don't remember the title.
I don't either. We'll put it in the description, Shannon, so you guys can promote it. But what I do remember was the big winners of globalization, right? In North America, Europe, in Asia. And what the data was showing was that the winners of globalization were those that first integrated regionally before they engaged international markets. So North America, 40% of international trade of North America is within North America, U.S., Mexico, U.S., Canada. 60% of European international trade is within the European Union, within Europe. And in Asia was interesting because Asia started, I think, at 25%, give or take, in 1989 when this hyper era globalization began. And I think it's upward at 65+% now. So and that's, China as well, kind of broadening out. So I think what's coming now, and this is, I think, was Shannon's argument, and I see it in Latin America, and we're going to jump in down to talk about Mexico, is regionalization, right? There's a regionalization effort to kind of bring markets closer to home. It's not like ISI, which was inward of a country. This is more like within a neighborhood,
regional,
within a regional neighborhood that shares many things, shares culture, shares demographics, shares language, in some cases shares race and ethnicity, but it has commonalities that even in markets are necessary to be able to translate consumer goods, because it's, it wasn't easy for, these big corporations, Nike, Google, whatever, Google isn't gone, but Nike or any of these other big corporations to go to Asia because they had to learn about Asian customs and traditions and culture. I mentioned that because, Mexico, right? So the big story with Mexico that we see in the United States is beyond the border, we're going to talk about that in the cartels, is, NAFTA. NAFTA was the big story during the era of globalization. Right. And then now we have the USMCA, which is kind of, I don't know how you view that, but if it's like an extension of NAFTA or redoing NAFTA, but it's essentially this trade agreement between the largest trade partners of the world. Where does Mexico fit into that? Because have they been the losing end of this trilateral agreement, or is it, how do you see it?
I see it through the lenses of, some people don't like it, but dependency theory. Yeah. We were an important part of North America, and we are still an important part of North America in a different way. I mean, North America as a regional trade agreement only, not going towards what is the European Union. We have people, and that's where we miss to talk about India, for example. Mm-hmm. India, how has India become a world power too? Mm-hmm. Because of its excess of population. Yeah. And that's very important. So what is the role that Mexico plays here? And that was kind of like the decision to build these maquiladoras. And this is very important, and this is connected with the violence at the border and all these dynamics that I have been studying, right? So you have people, and you take people to the border. The big companies are going to the Mexican side of the border and have less regulations and can pay lower salaries. So it's supposedly a win-win situation. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mexicans don't have to go to the United States or don't have to cross illegally. They will have jobs, and that would stop supposedly undocumented immigration.
Yeah, those are the maquiladoras, right? And that's manufacturing companies that are located on the Mexican side, and they have benefits in many ways, right?
Are they all along the border, or are they mainly in the eastern side of the border?
There was a plan to do this all along the border, right? But there are poles of development. Yeah. And for example, in the central border in Ciudad Juárez, it's where probably the majority of the maquiladoras are located at. There's some in Reynosa, there's some in Matamoros, there are some in Tijuana, but mainly in the biggest industrial cities at the border. This is where they are at. And the maquiladoras were a core or a central part of the Mexican role within NAFTA. That was a promise of development after the import substitution industrialization model finished. And many Mexicans went to the United States because they started to lose their jobs because the agricultural sector, they stopped subsidizing a lot of products, agricultural products. So, and a lot of Mexican companies, because it was the end of import substitution industrialization. So in NAFTA, many people were unemployed, started to go to the United States, but a new world order started too. And Mexico was involved in NAFTA, and they were workers for this new project, right? And NAFTA changed a lot of logics of the hemispheric conversation. And at that exact time, 1994, when a lot of decisions in politics were also taken, and the generation of new democratic institutions. So this double transition at the same time, right? And this is something that happened in many other countries in the world. For on the one hand, this the end of history. Latin America, Eastern Europe, going with the same mentality than the United States, the dominating power. But Mexico was going supposedly with a bigger market, a smaller state, was going to move into a better world. We're going to develop and grow, and that was a promise.
And what happened?
Well, you could see 350,000 people that have been killed in the so-called drug wars, right? Levels of growth that...
But what went wrong? Because obviously something went wrong here, because the maquiladoras, I know the story of what you're describing, but it's actually now known more as an area of illicit activity, and there's all kinds of stories of human trafficking from the trabajadores de los maquiladoras que have to cross the border and things like that. So how would you describe it? And we could get into your specific trips to the border, because I'm sure you visited all these parts.
Mm-hmm, right.
But what went wrong in your view?
Well, I mean, this project benefited a lot of Mexican, not a lot, but important Mexican companies that were, part of that new type of development. Of course, products were sold in the United States. There were some manufacturing companies, of Mexican origin, that did well. Mm-hmm. But in this model, many people also went to the United States, and some of them stayed and worked in the maquiladoras, and some of them lost their jobs, less entrepreneurs. So you have an increase in the levels of inequality and poverty too during that time. But some did well, some did bad, but there was an increase in inequality. At the same time, there was more opportunities. There were more opportunities to to traffic drugs. Mm-hmm. And the markets of drugs started to diversify. During the PRI time, the PRI kind of managed drug routes and the drug trade itself. Mm-hmm. At the same time that...
The PRI, the political party, or the presidents that belong to PRI?
It's a model. It's a political model, the one-party state regime. But the party is the important figure here. Of course, the president was a central figure.
Would you say this began maybe during the Guadalajara cartel, or does it go before that? Because the PRI was in power for a long, long time.
Yeah, I mean, it's the Guadalajara cartel, and it coincided, of course, with the closing of the drug routes that were going through the Caribbean. Mm-hmm. And so that deviation of the drugs from Colombia, particularly cocaine, coming from Colombia, of course, and then being transported through Mexico when the Mexicans started
the balloon
to become...
effect, yeah.
Exactly. And that all coincided with, on the one hand, the enforcement that deviated the routes towards Mexico, and possibilities. NAFTA, for example, the building of different types of infrastructure to allow... Exactly, absolutely. Like, for example, the bridges in Nuevo Laredo, right? Mm-hmm. The World Trade Bridge, for example, that's in Nuevo Laredo is the place at the border that more cars cross. Mm-hmm. I mean, that in the two directions, and it was a part of NAFTA. So where the drugs are transported through the main
highways,
highways, exactly. So you have illicit goods going back and forth, and also illicit goods going back and forth. And I'm talking about also the transportation or the smuggling of not only drugs but also people, arms. You have more possibilities, more mobility, more transportation of goods, and inside the 18-wheelers, you can transport illicit goods and also illicit goods.
Yeah.
So NAFTA was a time where the loss of control or manage of the drug trade took place, and now you have more players, political players. You had a party, and the leader of the party was the president of Mexico, who made a lot of decisions. A very powerful man. This man lost power when Fox arrived to power in the year 2000.
Vicente Fox, right?
Vicente Fox arrived to power in the year 2000. It was another party.
Was he was the first Span president? Is that right?
Exactly.
He broke the rule.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was the end of the PRI regime. We count it like that. There were triumphs of politicians of different parties in local elections, state elections, governors. But then after Vicente Fox arrived to power, most of the governors were PRI governors. But other candidates from other parties started to win elections. So now the drug trade started to break its logic, and groups started to fight for control of the drug areas. And so there was another logic, and the so-called drug wars started because the group started to and to connect with different politicians at different parts of the routes. Okay. So that logic was broken. And this is where things started to become very complicated. And the fights for the drug plazas, the fight for the drug spaces, I would say, started in the exactly
so let me recap a little bit so you make sure our listeners, our viewers are kind of grabbing all this, because I think this is a good history. It's an important history. A lot of you that are concerned about what's happening in the U.S. southern border, if you don't know this history, it looks like it's happened all in the last few years when it really hasn't. It's been a kind of an evolution of what goes on in Mexico, what goes on in the United States, our trade relationship that's exploited by illicit actors. Because, I mean, that's the thing about trade, right? Like whenever you build something, it doesn't necessarily mean only good people are going to use it. It's whatever can use it will use. Technology is the same way, right? You can have a cell phone that's good for communication with your family. It's also good for bad business from illicit actors. So I guess in a summary, NAFTA gets signed to build a lot of infrastructure, particularly on the U.S.-Mexico border. And that infrastructure coincides with the time where the balloon effect happens between cocaine trafficking we used to be moving through the Caribbean into Puerto Rico, up into the United States. It gets shut down, in Miami principally. It gets shut down, or it gets at least clamped down, and that effect takes over to the land corridor through Mexico. Exactly. So the transportation, the infrastructure that's been developed because of NAFTA is now exploited by cartels, because it's an easier logistical maneuvering to get your products into the United States consumer markets. They
started as employees of the Colombians, but then Mexicans know their territory, and so they started to produce and to not only to transport, not only to be employees and to work in collaboration, but they started to be like the lords.
And then now they're down in the production countries, controlling production as well, the big cartels from Mexico.
Exactly.
So this happens, this takes place. This is kind of like a second order effect of globalization. I mean, perhaps not what it was intended to do, but it's what happened.
Exactly.
Does maquiladoras end up becoming overrun by cartels in other places that are starting to use it? Or
No. The maquiladoras, and this is important, they are foreign companies that are located in Mexico, very close, or at the border on the Mexican side, so they pay less taxes, have less regulations, environmental regulations.
But are they extorted by the cartels?
They have not been so affected by the cartels. That's a very important point. What has happened is that when they were built, they generated a lot of internal migration. So people from, let's say, Veracruz, Chiapas,
the south of Mexico,
of Mexico, where people need work, went to the north. And so these cities, like Ciudad Juarez, which is like the biggest city of maquiladoras, these cities started to grow very fast, but not with the social infrastructure that was needed to generate a space of stability. So a number of people coming from different parts of the country with the different needs, started to go there. And this is what explains like the dead women of Juarez, right?
Yeah.
A number of women went there, and you see a lot of women that are alone, have kids. The kids have to be, in the street. There's no infrastructure to deal with this, and of course impunity and many things. It was a perfect storm for the groups that wanted to traffic drugs to the United States. Also had also the capacity. It also took time. It also took place at a time where the model started to change, to transform. By the end of the 1990s, this model had changed with the creation of Los Zetas. So these groups, not just dedicated to the drug trade, they started to find, because they were connected with former military personnel, former special forces.
Yeah, describe the beginning of this, because I don't know if everyone knows the beginning of the Zetas. Describe how the Zetas were formed.
Yes, the Zetas were formed in the state of Tamaulipas, in the city where I was living in Brownsville, but in Matamoros. But that was like the heart of the Gulf cartel, and the leader of the Gulf cartel at that time was trying to protect the main centers of distribution of drugs along the border, the Tamaulipas border. And at that time, the Ociel Cárdenas Guillén, who was the leader of the Gulf Cartel, met Arturo Guzmán de Sena, who was one of the leaders, one of the main Zeta, the first Zeta people that were trained in, they were special forces of the Mexican army. They were trained in counterinsurgency operations in the south of Mexico to deal with what appeared in 1994, the Zapatista movement in Chiapas. So they were trained for that because this movement seemed to be a bigger movement, a social movement, an insurgency, but it ended not to be that way. It ended in itself, talking about autonomies. It was more an indigenous movement in the end. But it started to be a class movement. It started to be an insurgency, and they were trained. We don't know where they were trained. Some people allege that they were trained in the United States because many of the special forces of the armies in our region are trained in the United States, but we don't have that certainty. At least I don't. Many people take it for granted, but that information is not available, or at least I haven't seen it. But the thing is that they were trained. Their job finished, and they went to the border as part of the judicial police, many of them the federal police, or dealing with anti-narcotics operations in collaboration with the United States. There was a time when the United States was certifying other countries. That happened by the end of the 80s, early 90s. And at that time, some people decided to work for the anti-narcotics police, federal police, and they were part of the enforcement authorities, anti-narcotics enforcement authorities, and the narcotics authorities.
How did they transform into a cartel, being involved in the drug, not enforcement, but on the distribution?
They had special capacities, and they started to become part of a Praetorian Guard of Ociel Cárdenas Guillén that was in fight against different groups that wanted to control that very important strategic frontier for the drug trade. So at that frontier, you had maquiladoras and you had drugs moving along this very special shape of the Tamaulipas frontier, particularly Nuevo Laredo.
Is that the Rio Grande Valley sector of the border, or is that a little bit further east?
Further west.
West, okay.
Yes, the southmost part of Texas is this. This is kind of this is Matamoros and Brownsville. Yep. Then you have McAllen and Reynosa. That's also a very interesting area. But you have a very long and special border where there are not many things in Mexico. You have Matamoros, you have Reynosa, and then you have Nuevo Laredo. But in Nuevo Laredo is especially because of the connection with big highways and how it is connected to the main highways of the United States. I-96 it goes to Texas, and it goes to New York, everywhere, right? In the U.S. It's important that point connects.
That's Reynosa.
Reynosa is one. Yeah. But Nuevo Laredo is another one.
Okay.
Reynosa, Matamoros, and Nuevo Laredo.
So Nuevo Laredo, it's adjacent to what part of Texas? Is it?
Laredo and Nuevo Laredo.
Laredo,
Texas.
Okay, right.
Nuevo Laredo, Tamaulipas. It's a very important city because, as I said, it's the biggest customs of the...
Yeah. We have a military base there.
Exactly.
I've been there, yeah. Okay.
Exactly. And this is where the biggest number of cars circulate every day through Nuevo Laredo. And they have these...
Do you get a sense of the volume? What's the number? Do you know?
I don't remember.
Don't worry about it.
It's it changes every year.
But it's one of the busiest borders in the world. It's the center of vehicular traffic.
Yeah, all along the border and in Latin America. In the region, the whole region. And so that place and that plaza was very important for the so-called drug cartels because of the number of drugs that you could pass through there. The capacity of the Customs and Border Protection to verify the 18-wheelers is very small. The percentage is very small, so a lot of drugs.
So it was a numbers thing. flood it with more and more and more. You'll get some interdicted, but a lot will pass through.
Exactly, but that was a main plaza. So Arturo Guzman de Sena, who was at some point was part of the Mexican military, had the capacity, the training, and there were a number of them that were so-called Los Zetas that were part of the federal police at that time that were doing anti-narcotics operations.
Okay.
They meet, and they became the Praetorian Guard of this drug trafficker. But then they were sent to Nuevo Laredo to deal with the problems in Nuevo Laredo, and they found that because of their training, that because of the access to high caliber weapons, they could control all the activities within the city. So they started to diversify their capacities. They started to dedicate themselves to take money from all the illicit businesses, and
or
they
extortion.
started extortion, kidnapping. They also started to dedicate themselves to human smuggling.
Yeah.
And
But what made them make that shift? Was it because there was a need and they had a capacity, and so they filled the need, or was there the economies were shifting in that part, or what?
It is a lot of things. What happened is when NAFTA arrived, there are more activities, right? And at the same time, if you control a territory, because that was the logic of them, they had high caliber weapons and they had training. And what is, the mentality of the armed forces, it's like controlling your territory. Territorial control is a basic, as you know. So the territorial control allow them not just to control the drug trade, but there are many other activities that you can control. And they started, it was organically, the capacity that they had to provide protection, for example. So there was another source of income for them. So also they started to force the local law enforcement to work with them when local law enforcement were receiving very low salaries. They didn't have training. So it was another thing that they then were able to dominate the whole enforcement, and everybody worked for them. They were kind of the leaders of that territory, and they extended that model all along that border.
So this is going to jump right into, I don't think it's your first book, but one of your more recent books that I think made a big splash, which is Los Zetas Inc., right? It's published in 2017. And this book, would you say, was one of the ones that described this process that we're describing now?
That's exactly a book that describes exactly that. How organized crime was modified, and how Los Zetas model, not just Los Zetas, because Los Zetas changed the face of organized crime, I allege, not only in Mexico. Colombians will probably say that I am wrong, but I believe that this bringing the militarization to their model.
I think that's pretty well understood. I mean, the Zetas were military members, highly trained military members, special operations types. And then they brought this know-how to an illicit organization. Like I'll backtrack a little bit, and then we'll get back on track on what we're talking about with Mexico. But my parents are from Bolivia, and so in Bolivia we have this kind of a bad reputation with cocaine because it's one of the producing countries. And during the Pablo Escobar years of the Cali cartel and the Medellin cartel in Colombia, they wanted to get a sense of how to use legal mechanisms to be able to do judicial evasion on drug trafficking, and Bolivia had a special expertise in that because the Pablo Escobar Bolivia, Roberto Suarez, right? He was an economist from the London School of Economics, so he essentially understood a kind of I guess the word cartel comes from this because it's from the UK, right? I think it's cartel means like a franchise or something, and I might be butchering that, but I know the term. He took it from his time in London, and what he just, according to this this narrative, that when Pablo Escobar met with Roberto Suarez says you need to cartelize your franchise, right? You have to be able to structure it in a way that has compartmentalization, but also has easy access and distribution. So he basically organized it like a business. And so that transformed the Colombian cartels to be able to operate much more business-like. And then I think what you're describing, the Zetas then add the enforcement arm.
Exactly,
That,
exactly. They have always been a business.
Yeah.
I mean, we cannot understand them. We cannot understand illicit networks or illicit businesses by only focusing on the bad guys.
Mm-hmm.
They are companies. They are businesses.
Yeah.
They are illicit businesses. But exactly, Los Zetas brought a component that had never been present before. This capacity to control territories. Allow the diversification of criminal activities. This is why when I talk about Los Zetas Inc., it's a model. It's a model of corporations that is benefiting other corporations because of the dynamics it causes and because of the displacement. At the same time, in the year 2006, Felipe Calderón Hinojosa declared a war on drugs to generate what I called a new civil war or a modern civil war.
When was Los Zetas born? 2000?
Los Zetas were born by the end of it's not a definite date, but it's at the end of the 1990s, early 21st century. At that moment.
So that's another correlation on what we're describing, because we're describing the end of the
exactly
at that same time frame, the opening of the democratic system in the extension of the globalization that's happening in Mexico. Pan Vicente Fox becomes the first non-pre president in Mexico in a long time. And the Zetas start to form in this period. Right?
But the Zetas were working for the Gulf Cartel.
Yeah.
I mean, they started to work with the Gulf Cartel in the year 2003, 2004. Okay. This is when Ociel Cárdenas Guillén was arrested, but they still work with the Gulf Cartel. But they were sent to Nuevo Laredo. Still, Ociel Cárdenas had control from Mexico, but he was extradited to the United States in 2007.
Okay.
And this gave them more independence. And so from Nuevo Laredo, they started to form the company, their company. So they were called La Compañía, which is interesting, right? How some of these groups have called the enterprise, the ones that were in Michoacán, and how the Compañía, started to be another type of same Zetas model, because the Zetas went to Michoacán. And the Compañía was like, why should we allow these people coming from Tamaulipas? We are La Compañía, La Empresa, sorry. It was La Empresa in Michoacán. La Compañía, it was the name that was taken from those that were working for the Gulf Cartel, the Zetas, and the
So
Gulf
before
Cartel.
they were called the Zetas, they were called La Compañía.
La Compañía is it's like now they are kind of partners.
Okay.
That's how they call themselves, right? In the beginning, it was just the Gulf Cartel. Los Zetas were these enforcers. But then they work still there, but then the leader, Ociel Cárdenas Guillén, lost control when he was in the United States. They continue working together, but in a compañía, in partnership. They saw themselves as partners then, and they were then Los Zetas working together, but they became independent.
Okay.
And this is why in the year 2000, by the end of 2009, things started to become risky. They wanted to become completely independent, and in 2010 they started a war.
Yeah. And you were talking about this with Calderón, right? With Calderón comes in 2006, is that right?
2006, at the end of 2006.
Correct. And he declares a war on the cartels. So describe that. Where's the Gulf Cartel fit? Because he really was a war against the Gulf Cartel and the Zetas, right? Or specifically.
Supposedly, he declared a war on organized crime. He declared a war on drugs. He declared a war, a narco war.
But did he declare war on Sinaloa?
He declared the war supposedly on everyone. Yeah. The thing, and this is how the ones who were close to Calderón see it, that they didn't see the Sinaloa cartel. This is the story.
Yeah, from them.
This is the story. But as we know, Genaro Garcia Luna, according to the trial, was receiving bribes from the Sinaloa cartel. But supposedly, and this is a time where there were a lot of narco wars. and the Beltran Leiva brothers separated from the Sinaloa cartel. And you had other cartels. You had the Tijuana cartel that was at that point a little bit weakened because of what had happened in the years 2003, 2007 in Tijuana. So you had a number of groups, as I said, that were part of a division that was created because of the end of the PRI regime. But the thing is that with this very violent so-called war for first for Tamaulipas and war for the from the Gulf Coast and northeastern part of Mexico, this is when the Gulf Cartel and Los Zetas started a very violent conflict in the year 2010, because a Zeta member was killed in Reynosa by the Concord Tres was killed by the Metro Tres. That's kind of like the story, and that is all described in the book Los Zetas Inc. So they started a fight, a very, very violent fight, and supposedly because of also the capacities that they have, the strategies, the extortion, the kidnapping, the beheadings, the brutality they exercise against the population. So during the time of the war on drugs, the Mexican government dedicated their efforts at that part of the country because of the brutality. That's how Calderon justifies and his the person of intelligence, Guillermo Valdez, justifies himself. I have been present in a number of presentations. So supposedly they were going against everyone, but they had priorities. And their priority was, and I'm not justifying anything, I know that there has been a trial against Genaro Garcia Luna, and Genaro Garcia Luna was declared guilty for receiving bribes from the same guys he was supposed to be fighting. It was not a war against them, but it seemed to be a war against them because the most horrible moments, the most brutal moments, and the confrontations, the biggest confrontations between the Mexican armed forces and the federal police, because the federal police and the armed forces were fighting a conflict. Were fighting, and they were involved in activities that were not the ones that they were prepared for, right? So it was a time where there was a lot of brutality, and the brutality was centered in the northeastern part of Mexico.
Let's talk a little bit about Genaro Garcia Luna, because you wrote another book among the many books you've written, a more recent book that was published in 2021 in Spanish called Los Cinco Vidas de Genaro Garcia Luna, The 5 Lives of Genaro Garcia Luna. You co-authored it with Tony Payan, your co-author. So you spoke to him, interviewed him, is that right?
Okay. Yes, we were writing a book that appeared some months after this book. It's titled The Improvised War, The Years of Calderon and Its Consequences, also in Spanish. And for that book, we started to interview in the year 2013, 2014, a number of people that were connected to the Calderon years. Those that were very, very close to Calderon. Calderon had written his book. We didn't have to give him voice. He had already talked. But people that were very close to him, like his chief of intelligence, Guillermo Valdez, Genaro Garcia Luna, a number of people that designed and implemented the so-called drug war, the security strategy in Mexico. Some people call it the drug war. That's how he presented himself. He's declaring a war on cartels. But then we talked to many of them, and in one opportunity in Houston, we had a chance to talk to Genaro Garcia Luna, to spend 3 days with him. So when he was arrested, we had that interview and our observations, and we also talked to different people
before he was arrested.
And yes, he gave a talk then it was called the Mexico Center. Now it's called the Center for United States and Mexico of Wright University, the Baker Institute. That's right. He was invited to give a talk, and he spent with us 3 days, and he gave us we discussed about different things, and for the book, he was one of the characters, and he was the main character because everybody that described him as the guy who was closer to Calderon, the one who received more money, the one who received the attention, and everybody was talking to us. He talked a lot about the strategy itself. He talked to us about Los Zetas, about his trajectory, his career, his perspectives on the different actors, political actors, journalists, advocates. We also interviewed activists, advocates. He was talking bad about everyone, but he really talked very highly of his United States friends, U.S. government officials, and it seemed that he had a very good relationship with a number of them.
He was. I remember he used to come. I don't know him, but I remember he used to come to Washington. Very well respected, well decorated as well.
Yeah, that's very interesting, right?
Yeah. But we had the incident with the defense minister as well. Remember, the defense minister was also very well decorated, well respected in the U.S., and then also got arrested in Los Angeles. But I think he got returned to Mexico.
He returned. He returned to Mexico, and supposedly the investigation was going to be done in Mexico. The Attorney General's office found nothing, and finally he's
found nothing, or didn't look very hard.
I don't think they look very hard, and the file is all redacted.
Sealed,
it's all redacted, so you cannot see really what the information.
But so what you're describing now is you're describing. Okay, so you have a war on drugs. It's simplistic way to put it, but it's essentially how they put the banner sticker on it. It effectively did capture, and would you say it dismantled the Zetas to some level?
Wait, this is very important. Yes, the efforts were centered in the northeastern part of Mexico and the Gulf Coast, which is the Zeta zones, the Zeta areas. But the Zetas were a particularly interesting group. Some people compare their model to a franchise. I don't think it's necessarily a franchise. I studied them as criminal corporations with different, like a big corporation that dedicates to different businesses in different places. And they were connected to some extent, but it's a big corporation. I compare that to Exxon, to a big corporation. But some people have compared them to a franchise. And they kind of they had a special model, and the brutality was part of it. And then the brutality of the armed forces arrived, and these groups, and they started to arrest. The kingpin strategy, Genaro Garcia Luna was very well connected with the DEA. So the kingpin strategy was implemented at the best that you could have implemented them. So they started to arrest a number of drug lords. And that started to cause a fragmentation of these two organizations in particular that had military personnel, or at least have the logic that military personnel brought
the two organizations
to this organization, two organizations.
The organizations Zetas and
Gulf Cartel. Because in the end, they had the same practices. It's the same thing with La Familia Michoacana. The Zeta model. My book is not about Los Zetas. It explains how they were formed, but it's a model. It's an economic model. It's a way to extract rents from different businesses.
So they become decentralized.
They became decentralized. They became fragmented. They adapted. And so the other day
which is a response to the kingpin strategy, because if you don't have a king of the snake, you don't have the head of the snake, then what do you go after? There's no kingpin, right? There's just a bunch of local
complex adaptive systems.
And
because they are systems, in the beginning you could see the companies, you could see the leadership, but then this leadership is lost, and then and you know that military strategy, you know how it becomes very difficult to manage. But exactly the logic of Calderon, and we talked about a number of people that understood very well, that implemented, that thought about it. The thinking was, okay, we're going to turn this national security problem into a public safety problem. So we're going to have small guys, and we're going to fight them with the police. Nothing like that happened. It is all a failed war, a failed strategy, because this never happened. We don't have even police now anymore. At the federal level. We don't have federal police.
We've seen that happen, from the military side, because, I had a conversation once with General Petraeus, and he, people forget he was also the director of the CIA. And when he was director of the CIA, he spent a lot of time in Mexico, actually, and he spoke with President Calderon. He kind of gave a privy to one of those conversations, and he said that he had been coming from the Middle East, becoming Afghanistan and Iraq in particular. And, we had a lot of experience back then with counterinsurgency and going after terrorists and insurgent groups that were basically controlling territory inside Iraq and Afghanistan that the United States was trying to wrestle control from them. And so he used that model to kind of overlay into Mexico and to say, let's look at the cartels from an insurgent perspective, not necessarily from just in illicit activities. And he described the structure and the territorial control of the cartels as I think, and I might get this number a little bit off, but he said it was about 20 times as big as the Iraqi insurgency, in Mexico. And when he had that conversation with President Calderon, he said, President Calderon got freaked out. He said, okay, but you're going to fight this with less than a tenth of the budget that we were using in the Iraq war. And so,
interesting.
so it's interesting because what you're describing to me is the same thing that we saw in the Middle East. Whereas, you had, Al-Qaeda, right? Al-Qaeda was a franchise at some level, right? But then what you had was these little mini Sunni Salafist jihadist groups that pretty much only concerned with was controlling one neighborhood, one territory. Exactly. And that allowed them to have leverage with negotiations with Osama bin Laden or whoever's, Zarqawi, whoever's representing them, Al-Qaeda, the franchise at the time. But it also allowed them to stay kind of beneath the radar, so that the big, the Pentagon, Central Command, all the big military people, they don't really look at you as like a big fish because you're not a big fish, but you're actually it depends which territory you're in. You could be in a very critical area of the supply chain, and so that's basically what I hear you describing.
Yes, yeah. and there was a reconfiguration of organized crime, and you are not talking about a cartel. Mm-hmm. First of all, I think that the word cartel, the concept is wrong.
Yeah, what's old? Yeah.
It's old, exactly. It's old, exactly, because you were talking about Pablo Escobar, Bolivia, Pablo Escobar, and Colombia. But now, the way that media represents these groups is like there's a cartel, there's a corporation, there's a company. But that's not true. We are talking about systems and the complex adaptive system. They became like these small cells that adapt.
Yeah, and autonomous.
Yeah, autonomous, and not all of them are trafficking drugs. Some of them are just kidnapping. Some of them are participating in human smuggling, and they manage because of the capacity. They have arms. They control the territory. So if you want to bring, with smugglers, with human smugglers, you want to bring your people through here, you have to pay me per person this money, and I will give you a code. That's exactly what they do. Some of these groups that they are complex adaptive systems, and so you see how they now behave in Tamaulipas, in Zacatecas, and they were Zetas zones. They have always been Zetas zones in Veracruz, in Tabasco. All these groups are dominating illicit activities, and they are part of illicit networks. So we cannot think of cartels. First of all, a cartel. What is a cartel? Like the OPEC, right? Yeah. So you are not talking about all these actors sitting down and saying, "Hey, let's see how many drugs we're gonna be." They fight against themselves. So it's counterintuitive, even like thinking of these groups as cartels.
Yeah.
So it's wrong. And we are talking about systems, complex adaptive systems. And this is why supposedly now the Mexican government is changing its strategy towards the cartels and it's not confronting the cartels. We still see a number of murders. Yeah. Why? Because we are talking about complex adaptive systems, and you cannot finish. It's very difficult to deal with those groups.
Well, we have this, we're studying complex adaptive systems in terms of criminalized states, right? So governments that then get embedded into the organized crime business. And what you find there is this element of actors that we call adaptive agents, right? So the adaptive agents are those individuals that are both in the formal licit enterprise. They're either businessmen, NGOs, civil society actors, sometimes political actors, but they also dabble into the illicit enterprise. But their main purpose is to legitimize the illicit, right? So we call them adaptive agents. And those, what you would look at before, and this is like, kind of flies against the kingpin strategy, because in the kingpin strategy, they wouldn't be that important because they're low on the totem pole. They're not making big decisions. But in the system strategy, they're like the most important because they're the ones that are making this normal. They're the nodes. They're the critical nodes, right? Because they're making that activity normal. They're making that activity prevalent. They're spreading it into other businesses and territories and industries. So I 100% see where you're coming from. Let me ask you this: does Sinaloa also become through this process? Does Sinaloa also atomize into systems, or does it maintain some of that command and control?
It is a very good question, and I'm writing about this right now because I'm writing a second edition of Los Zetas. Yes, and it's going to take some time.
Sinaloa Inc?
No, it's called Los Zetas Inc. Nueva Generación. This is
Okay,
Nueva
so
Generación comes.
Yeah.
I mean, what happened in the Pacific? It's a transformation, and you know, like Los Matacetas. Started from an arm of a cartel de Sinaloa, the Cartel del Milenio. They were starting to go after Los Zetas, supposedly, and there is there's big reporting about that from the LA Times. This journalist, her name, I don't remember the name, but the last name is Wilkinson. So she described what happened in Veracruz with Los Matacetas and how they were supposedly, or there's some kind of criminal paramilitarism and the utilization by the Mexican Navy and the government of Veracruz of members of the Cartel del Milenio. That was kind of the origin of Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. Nueva Generación and Milenio Cartel was connected with the Sinaloa Cartel. So basically they were formed within the Sinaloa Cartel.
So so you're saying, so that's a form of decentralization to some level,
Exactly. But then you don't explain how, like, some Matacetas.
Jalisco takes a little bit from Sinaloa and a little bit from Zetas. Is that right?
The model of Los Zetas, they were part of the anti-Zetas, the Matacetas. So the logic became different, and they started to become connected through these active agents that you're talking about, that adapt also. And so the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación started like that, and everybody's like, "Oh, El Mencho. Where is the Mencho? El Mencho had like dialysis, and he had, and he was created himself supposedly a hospital. Do you think that he can manage a big criminal corporation? It's not a corporation. Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación is exactly a network, a criminal network, or even franchises that are not connected to each other. Why not? Because everybody can be Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. And that's why you see Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación everywhere. That's what I'm going to describe. Exactly. And the Sinaloa Cartel, that's another thing. We now do not have the big leader, right? El Chapo Guzman. So we have Chapitos. And we have Chapitos participating in different cities in Jalisco and fighting against Jalisco Nueva Generación. But the logic is old. I mean, we are talking about systems, and Sinaloa Cartel, or the part of the Sinaloa Cartel, the command and control part, is probably the part that has a leverage over one activity, and it's drug trafficking. And this is important. For example, in the state of Sonora, they also have a very big business on human smuggling. So there are activities that they have been historically involved in, and there is command and control. But it's also getting the logic, following the logic of Los Zetas. We don't have El Chapo Guzman right now, as it was in the times of El Chapo Guzman. We have the Chapitos, we have El Mayo Zambada, we have other groups that work with them in different parts of the country, the enforcers. So we're talking about, again, a system or a network. You can see it as you can, right? A system, the adaptive agents, the adaptive agents, or the nodes in network analysis, the key nodes, right? So we have to start seeing these as that, and not as like the command and control part. But it seems to me that at this point, the drug trafficking part of the human smuggling part of the Sinaloa Cartel is still pretty, condensed and
no. And I think what you're describing, it helps understand the problem at the border, because those are different territories, right? They're all territories that have industry in textiles, and the ones in Juarez, but they also have cocaine, drug trafficking. They also have now human trafficking, human smuggling, arms trafficking. And what you're describing is and I think what we described throughout the whole entire podcast is kind of a reactionary element to different strategies to tackle this one big problem, right?
Exactly.
And it's adapted. It morphs. It doesn't go away. And I think the big question there is, are we approaching this all wrong?
All wrong.
Are we approaching this all wrong?
All wrong.
Yeah. Well, I got the answer's clear. The answer's clear. We are approaching it all wrong. But is the approach wrong not just from the way that we're describing and analyzing and diagnosing the illicit enterprise that's taking over the border, or is it even more deeper than that? And I'm going to go where we began. Are we not thinking even strategically enough about what globalization means, or what incentives align between formal enterprise, free enterprise, and illicit enterprise? Like, how does that all package in?
Yeah, it's a very complicated question, but I would say that if you diagnose something wrongly, if I say like you have a flu and you have a cancer,
you give me a headache pill.
Exactly, and something is gonna. I mean, your body's gonna be destroyed inside, right? Yeah. And you're gonna die. This is more complex, right? So I think that diagnosing the problem, or just talking about cartels.
Yeah.
It's wrong.
Yeah, I see you're trying to change the language, the lexicon. You want the lexicon to modernize to what the current threat is.
Well, yeah. I mean, so you have criminal groups that specialize because they don't do everything. Los Zetas started doing everything in Nuevo Laredo. Yeah. And this is the way that I started analyzing them. They diversify, they do everything. They did. In the territory they dominated. But then they have adapted and they have, they have fragmented. So you have these groups just dedicating, some of them just to kidnapping, and some of these actors, the adaptive agents that are licit and do illicit things, like the ones that transport drugs, for example, the truck drivers or the 18-wheeler drivers that smuggle people, for example. And they are connected with armed groups that allow them through their territory. If we don't describe this correctly, if we don't, in social network analysis, utilizing military strategy and all these other ways to deal with security issues, also policing, right? So if you know who these adaptive agents are, you can take them and then you destroy the network. This is the thing that we're not. I think that the main thing is that there is a tendency, and it's political, it's economic too. It has the logics of the bureaucracy. Yeah. You don't want to stop the kingpin strategy. The DEA does not want to stop the kingpin strategy. You know how logics.
You know how to do it too. Like, it's something that you've done. They say you teach how you were taught, right? So if you were you have a generation of Mexican police and military officers that were taught a certain way of how to deal with this problem, it's very difficult to break that tradition because you that's what you do.
In Mexico, there's another problem. I'm talking about the anti-narcotics operation.
Yeah,
and I'm talking about the DEA, the role of the DEA, and what they want to pressure upon, right? They insist in the kingpin strategy, even with the bicentennial framework approach, which was, I think it was interesting, connecting all and understanding the different dimensions of the problem. But then the first thing that it's done when the bicentennial framework starts is like, okay, here are the rewards for los chapitos. I'm like, okay, good. Yeah. Kingpin strategy at its most. Yeah. So, of course, that's one thing. In the case of Mexico, it's impunity, it's corruption, it's the multiplication of the adaptive agents because of impunity. That's the thing, right?
Yeah, so that in warfare, there's this saying in the military, it's experts talk strategy, but professionals talk logistics. So, when you go to war, obviously there's the big brains and all the strategic people that are in, the Pentagon and other places that are talking about how we're going to approach this war, how we're going to fight this war. But when you actually had to fight the war, it's actually those that can actually move the transportation, get what they call the beans, bullets, and band-aids from one A to B to Z. Those are the ones that actually execute this to make it effective and actually work. My point to that is the saying that, what we learned through the war on terror, it's also kind of a simplistic term, just kind of like the war on drugs, but it's what we learned through those 20 plus years is that the logistical networks matter because the logistical networks is what makes everything function. We can go after terror leaders, we can go after terror financiers, we can go after a lot of these folks, and some of it's very well needed. But unless you dismantle the logistical networks, though, they just replicate and they grow again. So what you're describing to me is the logistics, and I have to end it here because we want to get you back on, Guadalupe, because we didn't even get into the NGOs and your time on the border. I didn't even want to ask her one question about her time on the border, but it was so interesting, the history, because I think the history sets that up to be able to talk more about that. But there's this thing about, and you know this because of economics, right? 'Cause at the end of the day, the reason I studied economics was because it helped me understand human action. And what you understand with human action is that we're all driven by incentives, right? Anyone that's got a job knows that the incentives matter. And when the incentives for free enterprise, the incentives for production get overtaken by the incentives for predation, then illicit enterprise has a bigger chance of growing than free enterprise. And what you have is the logistics around that starts to move towards more bad activities. Exactly. And I think that what we're describing in this conversation is that globalization had a dark side. Right. It had a dark side that didn't maybe intend to do this, but inadvertently, second, third order effect, allowed to incentivize a logistical network that started to grow as these companies were making money and everything like that, but they started to grow, and the quote unquote cartels, but the transnational criminal organizations in Mexico figured it out. They figured out the system. They figured out how to work within the seams. Exactly. And now that's I think that's pretty much I think where we're at, because all the criminal organizations that we're looking at throughout the hemisphere, I can't say the world, but they all kind of following the adaptive system model. I mean, even to the level the FARC has done this in Colombia. Exactly. There's the group in Nicaragua, the Bacri in Colombia, exactly. I just came back from Ecuador, and it's I think it's 14,000 micro cartels in microtráfico in Ecuador. So and I think they all realize that this is a very successful way to evade kind of counter narcotics, law enforcement approaches that have been focused on what you're describing, the kingpin approach, that hasn't got rid of the problem. Absolutely. Is that fair to say? Is that how we describing it?
Yes, but there's it's fair to say, but you talked about globalization. I would say this double transition towards free markets and democracy, also democracy.
What would you say?
Democracy, because when the end of the PRI regime started with all these other dynamics, I'm not saying that democracy is bad in itself in any form, but it's very interesting how this coincides, right? Yeah. How when democracy came to Mexico, the democratization process started and consolidated with the triumph of the PAN, the dynamics changed. This perfect dictatorship that was able to manage the drug trade lost the control of it because of democratization. So it's just very interesting too.
Well, we have had that conversation today a bunch of times actually. So and I actually gave a presentation about that because we have this concept of democracies versus authoritarians now, right? That's like the big talking point in Washington. I think in different parts of the world. And I've always looked at it as a false dichotomy because people compare it to the Cold War with capitalism, socialism, but those were very clear, defined lines because the Soviet Union defined themselves as a communist socialist regime, United States capitalist. We don't have that with autocracy. There is no government or regime in the world that considers themselves autocratic. They all consider themselves democratic. They call each other autocratic. Some of them call the United States autocratic. So it's kind of a false dichotomy. And what it turns into is just democracies versus democracies. And what I've described is democracy, if you study democracy, and I think there's a lot of democracy scholars, including you probably yourself, but if you study democracy really didn't, didn't have its day in the 20th century was really, was where representative democracy flourished, but it didn't have its day. And I say the birth of the representative democracy model was until we discovered nation state sovereignty, 1648, Peace of Westphalia, right? So we fought a 30-year war to be able to get to that. Yeah. But what we described is once a nation state can have its identity, can have its sovereignty, can have its territorial integrity, and then we can actually talk about a democratic model.
That is right.
And I think what's at risk today is not, and it goes to what we're talking about with the cartels and stuff, organized crime. What's at risk today isn't democracy per se, the practice of democracy. It's territorial integrity and the state sovereignty.
Absolutely.
And that's why borders matter.
Absolutely.
Because borders
matter.
define
Absolutely.
that sovereignty. Guadalupe, I would love to talk to you all night. And so here's what we're going to do, because my audience, they have to get engaged. So we're going to ask all our audience, I'm sure you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. We're going to put the links for all of Guadalupe's books. She has 5 of them. We talked about, I think, at least 2, maybe 3. She has some in Spanish, some in English. We didn't talk about Democracy in the Two Mexicos, but we'll hit on that.
And the
new one, The Frontera, A Journey Across. With that one, we have to say, because that doesn't even seem like just an academic book. That almost seems like a personal account, a journey.
It's a journey.
And I want to hear about the journey, and that's forthcoming in December 2023. So, but I want you guys to give me at least 700 likes to this video. So that we can get, Guadalupe will not come back for anything less than 700 likes.
No.
So there you go. There you go. She is a Mayan princess. So we're not going to get her back. We're not going to get her back for anything less than 700 likes. But we'll put the links to all her books. I think the main one we talked about today was Los Zetas Inc. I think that's in Spanish and English, right?
Yes, in Spanish and English.
Okay, so we'll put links to both of them. Are they available on Amazon?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so we'll put the Amazon links in the show description. Anything else you want to plug? You have a book coming out? Any other papers or anything you want? How do people find you, follow you?
I have a lot of papers.
You're pretty
and
prolific
articles.
on Twitter.
I'm prolific on Twitter. Not so much. I think I have more articles, but the Twitter it's the way that they can find me. G Correa-Cabrera.
G Correa-Cabrera.
Yeah,
okay.
G Correa-Cabrera. That's my.
Okay, we'll put her Twitter handle as well. Is that the main social media you use?
Yes, it's the main social media, but it's not called Twitter anymore.
Oh, it's called, yeah. I'm slow
X.
on the kib. Is it called X?
X.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
I'm not. That's gonna take me a while.
Yeah, it's gonna take everybody a while, but we adapt.
Yeah, exactly. Tell Elon Musk about his adaptive agents, because I'm sure he's. Yeah. Okay. So on X we can find Guadalupe. Guadalupe, I had a great time. I actually want to read the book. I haven't had a chance to read Los Zetas yet, Los Zetas Inc. But based on what you're describing, I'm going to read it. And then we want to have you back for your new book. When, that one come out in December? Is that right?
December. Yeah, December.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you, Guadalupe.
You're welcome.
We'll have you back pretty soon. All right. Thank you guys.
you.
Bye.
Subscribe to the Border Wars podcast and visit our website at securefreesociety.org. See you in the next episode.